Rikers Island, the hellhole behind New York's wall. Rikers Island, New York, an island that is known for its towering walls, brutal guards, and inmates who live in constant fear. But even beyond the reputation, something far darker was unfolding. On one grim night, a shocking event took place that would change everything at Rikers. A riot broke out, a terrifying, uncontrollable wave of violence. Prisoners, armed with makeshift weapons, clashed with the guards. It all started over a rumor about a new transfer who had been placed in a notorious part of the jail, an area known for its violence and power struggles. No one expected what was about to happen. The fight started small with a few prisoners arguing, but it quickly escalated. The chaos was swift, shouts echoed through the hallways, the air thick with tension. Then, suddenly the lights went out. Darkness fell over the already dangerous prison. The sound of footsteps, the clattering of metal, and the screams of fear were the only things left to hear. Inmates, many of them facing years of punishment, seized the opportunity to fight back. Weapons, made from broken pieces of metal and glass, were thrust into hands that had nothing left to lose. The riot spread like wildfire, and soon even the toughest of Rikers' notorious guards were outnumbered, running for cover. But the real shock came when one of the inmates, known for his violent history, climbed to the top of the prison's highest tower, waving a flag of defiance. His action sent a chilling message across the island. No one was in control anymore. What happened next would leave everyone questioning how deep the corruption and violence ran at Rikers Island. Would the authorities regain control? Or had Rikers become a lawless nightmare where no one was safe? The clock was ticking, and the island's fate was now in the hands of those with nothing left to lose. The question on everyone's mind was simple: who would survive? As the violence unfolded, chaos seemed to be the only rule that governed Rikers Island. Inmates who had spent years learning to survive through intimidation, manipulation, and brute force suddenly had the upper hand. The guards, once the ones in control, were now retreating, overwhelmed and outnumbered by the sheer force of the prisoners' fury. The makeshift weapons glinted in the moonlight as prisoners pushed forward, taking over parts of the prison that had long been off limits to them. For the first time in a long time, the prison was alive with hope. Hope that they could finally break free from the oppressive system that had kept them behind bars for years. But this hope didn't last long. In the midst of the madness, a new player entered the scene. His name was James "Big Red" Johnson. A name whispered in fear across the prison. He had been known to be ruthless, someone whose reputation had grown over the years as a powerful figure in the prison's underground world. He was not just another inmate, he was a leader. And now, in the middle of this riot, he saw an opportunity to seize control. James had spent years carefully building alliances with other inmates. He had promised them power, promised them safety, and now it was time to cash in on that promise. As the riot raged on, he saw the guards struggling, the chaos spiraling out of control, and he knew it was his moment. But James wasn't the only one with a plan. In another corner of the prison, a group of inmates had taken control of the prison kitchen. Led by a man known as Antonio, the chef Ramirez, they weren't interested in violence for violence's sake. They had a different agenda: control the food supply, control the inmates. But even they were not ready for what would come next. The violence that started as a rumbling in the heart of Rikers Island had now spread to every corner of the prison. Every inmate had their own reasons for joining the chaos, some for power, some for survival, and others simply to escape the prison's clutches. But none of them expected what was coming next. In the midst of the madness, a guard, perhaps one of the last loyal ones, sounded the alarm. A warning that brought the prison's SWAT team rushing in. But the inmates weren't about to go down without a fight. As the SWAT team stormed in, guns drawn, ready to quell the uprising, they were met with a fury they hadn't expected. Smoke filled the air, the sound of gunfire echoed, and a brutal standoff began. The once orderly prison had turned into a war zone. In the midst of the conflict, James "Big Red" Johnson stood tall, his eyes filled with a sense of purpose. He had the power now. But as the SWAT team closed in, something unexpected happened. Antonio, the chef Ramirez, and his group of inmates launched a surprise attack on the SWAT team from behind. The battle raged on, and it became clear that this was not just about survival. This was about dominance, and the future of Rikers Island would be determined by those willing to fight for it. Would the authorities be able to regain control? Or was Rikers Island lost to chaos forever? The battle for power had only just begun. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a decision would be made that would change everything. But what was it? The battle for control of Rikers Island was escalating into something no one had ever imagined. As the SWAT team clashed with the inmates, the once impenetrable walls of Rikers were now nothing more than a backdrop to the chaos. The prison had become a war zone, each section of the facility divided into violent turf wars. Every inmate had a piece of the island, but no one truly had it all. James "Big Red" Johnson, now a feared figure at the heart of the riot, moved like a king among pawns. His leadership, a mix of brutality and sharp intellect, kept him steps ahead of the guards and rival gangs alike. But even James knew that the moment of control could slip through his fingers if he wasn't careful. The tension in the air was thick, and in the madness of the battle, one wrong move could change everything. Meanwhile, Antonio the chef Ramirez, once a humble cook, was making his mark in ways no one had expected. While the chaos raged in the prison hallways, Antonio had taken control of the kitchen and turned it into his stronghold. Not just for food but for strategy. As the inmates who followed him grew in number, they began to organize their attacks with precision. Antonio had one goal: to control the flow of resources, food, water, everything that could sustain the inmates in this fight. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was about power. And he knew as long as he controlled the kitchen, he controlled the island. But it was the SWAT team's next move that would shift the tides. Reinforcements were called in. Riot gear-clad officers stormed the prison with a renewed sense of urgency. The previously chaotic but spontaneous violence now turned into a battle for life and death. James "Big Red" Johnson knew the moment had come. He had to make a choice. Stay and fight the overwhelming force of the SWAT team, or use the riot as a means to escape Rikers Island and disappear into the streets of New York. But his loyalty to his men, his power over the prison, held him there. He had worked too hard for this moment. The inmates had tasted freedom and they wouldn't give it up without a fight. It was then that the unthinkable happened. The prison's power went out again, this time for good. The guards were in disarray. Without power, the security systems, the surveillance cameras, the lights, they were all useless. The prison's control room was no longer able to monitor the rioters, leaving the guards in a vulnerable position. The inmates saw their chance. With the power down, the rioting intensified. James "Big Red" Johnson ordered his crew into the heart of the prison, pushing toward the central administration building. Antonio, the chef Ramirez, not far behind, had a different target in mind. He was headed for the weapons storage room. The prison's walls, once symbols of control, now felt like nothing more than a cage, each inmate now a beast fighting for survival. The tension was thick, and even the most hardened criminals could sense that a line had been crossed. But in the center of it all stood James "Big Red," ready to make his final move. As he reached the administration building, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The SWAT team had found a way into the facility. They had made it to the heart of Rikers Island, and they weren't there to negotiate. A new wave of panic swept over the prisoners. The inevitable showdown was looming. James's eyes locked with Antonio's from across the yard. They both knew what was at stake. A final battle was about to unfold between the two powerhouses. Would it be James "Big Red" Johnson who finally took control of Rikers Island, or would Antonio, the chef Ramirez, use his underground strategy to turn the tides? The walls of Rikers Island were no longer protecting the guards, they were a cage for everyone inside. Would the inmates rise victorious, or would the authorities crush the rebellion? The fight was reaching its breaking point, and no one knew who would survive to see the end of the night. The clash was coming. And only one side could come out on top. The atmosphere inside Rikers Island was tense. The air, thick with smoke and the sounds of clashing metal and shouted orders, echoed through the walls. The power outage had thrown the entire prison into chaos, and now, with the SWAT team pushing deeper into the heart of the riot, everyone knew the final confrontation was approaching. James "Big Red" Johnson stood at the entrance of the administration building, the flickering light of torches held by inmates casting long, haunting shadows across his face. His plan was simple: take control of the heart of Rikers, crush any resistance, and declare victory. But as he moved forward, something unexpected happened. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was Antonio, the chef Ramirez, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a fire burning in the yard. He was no longer the quiet inmate known for his cooking skills. Now he was a soldier of war, his hands stained with the same violence he had once cooked to escape. Antonio's eyes met James's, and without a word, the two leaders sized each other up. Both men knew that this was the moment. There was no turning back. James sneered. "You're making a big mistake, Antonio. This island belongs to me." Antonio didn't flinch. His calm demeanor, in stark contrast to the chaos around them, showed he had a plan. "The island belongs to whoever controls it," he said coolly. "And right now that's not you." The two men stood in the midst of chaos, surrounded by hundreds of inmates, all of whom had been swept into the battle for power. But even in this sea of violence it was clear, only one would walk out of this alive. Without warning, Antonio made the first move. He shouted, ordering his crew to charge, and the battle between his men and James's began. The sounds of violence intensified as inmates clashed, but it was clear that this wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for dominance. James's men were quick to retaliate, their movements synchronized, each blow strategically placed. But Antonio's group fought with purpose. Every strike, every move seemed to have a deeper meaning, a plan behind it. It wasn't just about survival, it was about making sure that whoever survived would have the power to rule. As the two factions clashed, a strange silence fell over Rikers Island for a moment. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, the feeling that the very soul of the prison was hanging in the balance. It was a showdown unlike any before. Then everything exploded. The administration building's doors flew open, and through the smoke, a line of heavily armed SWAT officers stormed into the yard. Their presence sent shockwaves through the crowd. The prisoners, already on edge, fell into complete disarray. The SWAT team was armed to the teeth, their armor gleaming even in the dim light of the night. The first few seconds of the confrontation were chaos. Shots rang out, the sound of weapons clashing with metal and the screams of prisoners filled the air. But amidst the chaos, James and Antonio's battle continued. James's crew fought fiercely, trying to push the SWAT team back. Antonio, seeing an opportunity, began to rally his men to flank James's side. It was in this moment that the unthinkable happened. As James, Big Red, charged forward to take control of the building, a shot rang out from the darkness. Antonio, realizing that the SWAT team was a more immediate threat than the power struggle between the two men, made a split-second decision. He shot James. The bullet struck James in the shoulder, sending him tumbling to the ground. His men hesitated, unsure of what to do, but Antonio's men seized the moment. They fought harder, pushing James's crew back inch by inch. James, now wounded, staggered to his feet, his blood staining the prison floor. His eyes were filled with fury as he looked up at Antonio. "You think you've won, Antonio?" James spat, his voice raspy from the pain. "This isn't over." Antonio, standing over him, watched as James's crew began to retreat, their morale shattered. He turned to his men. "This is our moment," he shouted, leading his crew forward. But just as Antonio took his first step toward victory, the prison shook. The walls rumbled and an explosion erupted from deep within the complex. A huge fireball shot into the air, and the force of the blast sent everyone crashing to the ground. The sound of alarms began to blare, the warning signals echoing throughout the prison. The explosion had triggered a massive breach, one that would open the gates to Rikers Island itself. The prison was no longer just a place for inmates, it was a ticking time bomb, and whoever controlled the island now had the power to control everything. As the explosion settled, the question on everyone's mind was clear. Who would make it out of this alive? But there was no time for answers, not yet. The battle for Rikers Island had just entered its deadliest phase. The explosion rocked Rikers Island like a tidal wave, sending shockwaves through the prison's already fragile walls. The fireball that erupted from deep within the complex was the spark that ignited a new chapter in the chaos. Smoke and debris filled the air, and the sound of alarms blared, signaling the breach. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The fighting, the shouting, the gunfire, it all came to a standstill as inmates and guards alike stared in disbelief at the massive destruction. But the pause was only temporary. Within seconds, the prison descended back into madness. The breach had been triggered by a group of inmates, led by none other than Antonio, the chef Ramirez. It had been a well-kept secret, an underground plan to blow open the prison's walls and make a run for freedom. And now the gates were wide open. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed as the doors to the outside world slowly creaked open, offering a fleeting moment of escape. Inmates, who had spent years behind bars, now saw an opportunity to break free. The riot that had started as a struggle for control now became a race for survival. As prisoners surged forward, trying to reach the outer gates, chaos engulfed the entire prison. The walls that had kept them inside now seemed like nothing more than a cage they had learned to live in. Antonio stood near the breach, watching the frenzy unfold. His eyes scanned the scene, his mind racing. This was it, the moment he had fought for. But the victory felt hollow. The explosion had not just opened the gates, it had also made the prison a battlefield. The SWAT team, still fighting to regain control, had their hands full. Officers rushed toward the breach, but the inmates were relentless, pouring through the opening like water through cracks in a dam. Meanwhile, James Big Red Johnson, still nursing his wound, staggered to his feet. His crew, though battered, had not yet given up. Despite Antonio's shot and the chaos around him, James's will to fight remained. He was no stranger to violence and he knew how to survive. But with the gates now open and the prison turning into a war zone, even James had to admit, things had spiraled far beyond his control. With his shoulder bleeding, he motioned for his remaining men to regroup. They had to make a choice, stick with the plan to seize power or escape while they still could. James was a man of ambition, but even he could see that this battle was no longer just about taking over the prison, it was about getting out alive. But as he moved toward the gates, the unexpected happened. A shot rang out from the shadows. This time it wasn't Antonio. It wasn't a member of the SWAT team. It was one of James's own men, a traitor who had been plotting his escape all along. In the chaos, he had seized the moment to take out James, hoping to steal the throne for himself. The bullet hit James in the chest, knocking the breath from his lungs. He staggered, falling to the ground, his eyes wide in disbelief. His men looked on in shock, unsure of how to react. James Big Red Johnson, the man who had fought so hard for control of Rikers Island, was now lying on the ground, gasping for air. His dream of ruling the island was crumbling, and all he could do was watch as his empire fell apart. Antonio, witnessing the downfall of his rival, felt a strange sense of satisfaction. But even in this moment of victory, he knew that the war was far from over. Rikers Island had become a powder keg, ready to explode with every passing second. The SWAT team, realizing the stakes had changed, began their final push toward the gates. The explosion had created the perfect diversion, and now they had one goal in mind: contain the breach and neutralize the prisoners. The battle raged on, but now the stakes were higher than ever. Prisoners, some with nothing left to lose, charged toward the gates. The guards, their numbers dwindling, were pushed back. Even as they fought valiantly, the overwhelming tide of inmates seemed unstoppable. In the midst of the chaos, Antonio had a decision to make. He could escape with his men, leave Rikers Island behind, and disappear into the night. Or he could stay and ensure that the victory he had fought for was complete. As the gate to freedom drew nearer, the question lingered: would Antonio risk it all for the ultimate power, or would he leave Rikers Island behind? But before he could decide, the sirens wailed again. The prison's outer walls began to shake once more. A second explosion. This time it wasn't just the gates. The entire section of the prison that housed the most dangerous inmates was collapsing. Rikers Island was coming apart at the seams. As the dust settled from the second explosion, it became clear: the fate of Rikers Island was now sealed. Would anyone survive the night? Would anyone even escape? The final showdown was imminent. The second explosion sent shockwaves across the island, shaking the very foundation of Rikers. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and the prison's outer walls seemed to tremble with every passing second. The fire had spread quickly, consuming the once impenetrable facility. Inmates, some still recovering from the first blast, now had to navigate through a maze of wreckage and fire. The once hardened walls of Rikers Island, built to keep people inside, now served only as a dangerous obstacle for anyone trying to escape. Antonio, the chef Ramirez, now covered in dust and sweat, stood frozen in the middle of the chaos. The explosion had opened up the prison like a can of sardines, and the inmates were pouring through the breaches like a flood. Antonio knew this was the moment to act. The opportunity to control Rikers Island was slipping away, but he wasn't about to let it go that easily. But then, just as he was about to rally his men, a burst of gunfire cut through the smoke. The SWAT team had found their way in, and they were not here to negotiate. They came in full force, guns drawn, with their eyes locked on Antonio and his crew. The battle for freedom had reached a fever pitch, and there was no turning back now. Antonio cursed under his breath. The SWAT team was trying to push back the inmates, but they were outnumbered. What had started as a fight for power within the prison was now a desperate battle for survival. There was no winning without making impossible choices. Across the yard, James Big Red Johnson, barely hanging on to life, watched from the ground. His breathing shallow, his chest bleeding, he knew that his moment had passed. The traitor who had shot him was long gone, but the damage was done. He had no fight left in him. His reign was over, and now it was about survival. If he didn't move, he would die here in the very place he had once ruled. James tried to push himself up, but his strength failed him. His eyes were blurry, his vision clouded by blood loss. He could hear the shouting around him, the sounds of battle growing louder, but all he could focus on was the open gate in the distance. The moment of freedom, slipping away with every passing second. As James collapsed back onto the cold concrete, the scene around him grew darker. He felt himself slipping in and out of consciousness, unsure if he would ever make it out alive. Meanwhile, Antonio's men continued to press forward, the smell of smoke and burning wood thick in the air. The SWAT team was retreating, struggling to regain ground. It seemed like they were winning. But Antonio, ever the strategist, knew that the game was far from over. In the chaos of the explosion he had noticed something. The guards were distracted. They were focused on containing the breach, but they hadn't closed off the perimeter. The gates were still open. Antonio moved quickly, his mind working at lightning speed. He signaled to his closest allies. "We're making a run for it," he barked. "We push through now while they're distracted. It's our only chance." The crew nodded, adrenaline pumping through their veins. This was the moment. They had fought for years, surviving the violence of Rikers Island, and now they were on the cusp of escaping. But just as they began to move toward the gates, another explosion ripped through the air. A third explosion. The force of it was devastating. The entire section of the prison that housed the solitary confinement units collapsed, sending massive chunks of concrete and steel raining down on the yard. The blast knocked everyone to the ground, including Antonio and his men. The force of the explosion was so powerful that it sent inmates and guards flying, their bodies thrown across the yard like ragdolls. For a brief moment, everything was still. The air was thick with dust and the sound of screams echoed from all sides. Antonio, dazed but alive, pushed himself up from the rubble. His eyes searched the yard, looking for his crew, but the devastation had caused confusion. Men were scattered everywhere, some unconscious, some dead. The smoke was so thick now that it was hard to see through it. Then, in the midst of the confusion, Antonio heard a voice, a familiar voice. "Antonio. Over here." It was one of his men, struggling to crawl through the wreckage. Antonio made his way toward the voice, fighting through the debris. His heart pounded as he reached out, grabbing the hand of his comrade and pulling him to safety. "We can still make it," the man gasped, his face covered in soot. "The gates, they're still open." Antonio's eyes narrowed. He had one shot left. But the SWAT team, realizing the prisoners were slipping through, regrouped and began advancing on the gates. Antonio's time was running out. If they didn't move quickly, the gates would be sealed and their escape would be over. With a roar of determination, Antonio signaled for the last charge. His men, battered but fueled by the promise of freedom, surged forward once more. They ran toward the gates, dodging gunfire and the remaining debris from the explosions. But as they neared the opening, a final shot rang out, cutting through the chaos. Antonio felt a searing pain in his side. He stumbled but didn't fall. His eyes locked on the gate, the last barrier to his freedom. He had come too far to stop now. With every ounce of strength he pushed forward, his men following closely behind. The sound of gunshots grew fainter as they neared the edge. And then, just as the last prisoner broke through, the gates slammed shut. Antonio, blood pouring from his wound, stumbled through the opening. But just as he was about to make his escape, he heard a voice from behind him. "You're not going anywhere." It was the voice of a SWAT officer. But Antonio didn't turn around. He didn't stop. He had made it. He was free. For the first time in years he felt the cool night air against his face, the sound of freedom just ahead. But what awaited him outside Rikers Island, a place he had dreamed of escaping for so long, was a world that was just as dangerous as the one he had left behind. And so, with a final glance at the collapsing prison, Antonio disappeared into the night, leaving behind the horrors of Rikers Island, but with no idea what would come next. The gates were open, but the true battle had only just begun. Antonio, the chef Ramirez, had made it out. As he staggered into the night, the cold air hit his face like a slap, a reminder that he was free, at least for now. Behind him, the crumbling walls of Rikers Island loomed like a fading nightmare, the distant sounds of gunfire and shouts now a mere echo in the vast expanse of New York City. For the first time in years, Antonio breathed without the heavy weight of the prison on his shoulders. But his escape wasn't the end, it was only the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. The streets of New York were a far cry from the hellish walls of Rikers, but they still held their own dangers. The night was dark and Antonio knew he couldn't trust anyone, not even the shadows. His mind raced. He had done the unthinkable, he had escaped, but now what? Rikers Island was a memory, but freedom was a foreign concept. He had nothing, no allies, no plan for survival outside the walls. The world beyond the prison gates was just as ruthless, and if he wasn't careful, the very streets he had once ruled in his own mind could become his grave. Antonio paused, his body aching from the wounds, the adrenaline still rushing through his veins. His eyes darted around, scanning his surroundings, every rustle and creak a potential threat. He had made it out alive, but the reality of his situation hit him harder than any prison sentence ever could. He had no home, no safe haven. He was alone. As he walked deeper into the city, his thoughts turned to those left behind. His crew, his men, the others who had fought with him to break free. He had led them through the chaos, made decisions that had cost some of them their lives. Would they survive the fallout? He knew the answer was unlikely. Once the prison had been breached, everything changed. But Antonio wasn't about to let the story end there. He had fought for survival, fought to escape, and now he had to find a way to keep living. He had to adapt, and he had to act fast. The city streets were unfamiliar to him, but he could feel the familiar instincts of survival kick in. Antonio had survived Rikers Island for a reason. He was resourceful. But now, with the blood of the fallen on his hands and the weight of his choices pressing down on him, he knew he had to be smarter than ever. Suddenly, a car rolled to a stop beside him, the low hum of the engine a sharp contrast to the chaos of the night. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a man behind the wheel. "Need a ride?" the man asked, his voice low and cautious. Antonio hesitated, unsure of whether this was a trap or a genuine offer. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something in the man's gaze made him pause. The man was offering him a way out. With no other choice, Antonio nodded. "Yeah." The man gave a slight smile, as though he had been expecting Antonio's answer. "Get in." Antonio slid into the car, the cool leather of the seat a strange comfort after the hard concrete of the prison yard. The car sped through the streets of New York, and for a moment, Antonio felt like he was back in control. But that feeling didn't last. The man didn't speak, and Antonio didn't ask questions. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional shuffle of tires over the pavement. Minutes passed before the man broke the silence. "I know who you are," he said quietly, glancing at Antonio out of the corner of his eye. "I've been following the riot at Rikers. You made quite an impression." Antonio's pulse quickened. "What do you want?" The man's grin widened. "I think we can help each other out." Before Antonio could respond, the car came to an abrupt stop in front of a building tucked away in an alley. The man turned to Antonio. "Welcome to my place. Let's talk business." Antonio hesitated but then stepped out of the car, his instincts still sharp. As he followed the man into the building, his mind raced. Was this another trap? Or was this his chance to finally carve out a new path for himself? Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with the sounds of machinery and the low hum of technology. It was clear this wasn't just any ordinary hideout. The man led him to a table where several laptops were set up, multiple monitors flickering with data. On the walls hung maps of various parts of the city, as well as photographs of people Antonio didn't recognize. The man took a seat and motioned for Antonio to do the same. "I run a few operations in the city," he explained. "I've been watching you, Antonio. You've got skills. Skills I can use." Antonio remained silent, studying the man. "What kind of operations?" The man leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "The kind that doesn't involve sitting in a cell for the rest of your life. I can give you a place, a purpose, something bigger than just surviving. But first you have to prove you're worthy. Rikers Island was just the start. There's a lot more out there, and it's all up for grabs." Antonio knew that this was the moment where everything could change again. The streets of New York were brutal, but this man was offering him something he hadn't had in years: control. Control over his own fate. But Antonio also knew the risks. Trusting people had never worked out well for him. He had been betrayed, used, and cast aside before. The last time he trusted someone, he had ended up in a prison that nearly broke him. Could he really take another chance? Before he could respond, the man slid a folder across the table. "This is the first job. We start small, work our way up. You'll have to prove yourself. Are you in or out?" Antonio's mind raced. The prison gates had opened, but they led him into a world just as dangerous as the one he had left behind. The choice was his. Without hesitation, he picked up the folder. "I'm in." As he opened the folder, Antonio realized something important. He might have escaped Rikers, but his fight was far from over. The streets of New York were full of opportunity, yes, but also danger, betrayal, and chaos. But one thing was for sure: Antonio wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop him from taking control of his destiny. And so, with the first mission in his hands, Antonio, the chef Ramirez, stepped into the shadows of the city, ready to forge his own path, just as ruthless and determined as he had been inside Rikers Island. The battle for survival wasn't over, it had just moved to a new battleground.